So the topic for the session right now is going to be applying search data for strategic business decisions. And this topic's particularly interesting to myself for two main reasons. One, I feel that search data is underutilized in organizations as a whole. And we've been familiar and we've used them obviously for a long period of time within SEO, within SEM, within digital marketing. But I still feel like we're scratching the surface into what search data can actually bring to an organization. The other side of it is I also feel like too often SEOs are not empowered and enabled to be more part of kind of the leadership and leading in the organization. So part of this conversation too is how us as SEOs can use the power of search data to gain the seat at the table and to be part of the larger kind of business and strategy conversations, and use this as a way to further evangelize not just our own career paths, but just the value that we bring to an organization. So before we jump into all that, just quick little piece on Searchmetrics. We are a software and data company, so we have a platform and suite that covers both search data's ranking informations, crawl data, content data, and then we also have a service branch of the organization that works hand in hand with our clients to bring that data to life into real action. We have locations, and our headquarters is in Berlin. I'm based here in the Bay Area, and then we also have representation in London, New York, and Croatia. A little bit more on myself. So as Cody said, I oversee the service side of the business at Searchmetrics. I've been in SEO and digital marketing for over 10 years. I've actually worked with Philip and the Textbroker team in the past with some shared large enterprise e-commerce clients. And then before Searchmetrics, I was on the in-house side, and I was managing the SEM and SEO efforts for a collection of sports specialty e-commerce sites. That was both here in the US as well as for a period of time in EMEA, and also spent some time working with those companies in Australia as well. So our story starts in a different place. And what I mean by that is obviously this year has been a whirlwind to say the least, but a lot's changed in this year. And if we go back and looking at kind of 2019, there was a study that Alpha UX did. And essentially what they're looking at is how are people making decisions, and of those decisions, how many of them are being kind of driven by data, intuition, like how are we making decisions? So in that study, one of the first kind of pieces is how important is it to use data in strategic decisions? No surprise here. Basically, everybody said it's, important or very important. So to me, no surprise. Like obviously, more information, you can make a better decision. That's a no-brainer. But how does that actually pan out when you're actually making those decisions? And what we found here is even though 91% were expressing that data-driven decisions are important, only 58% were actually practicing it. So that's a big divide and a gap or an opportunity for us as SEOs in organizations as a whole. And why then is that such a big deal? Or why is that happening if so many people think that it's important? Well, the top reasons from this study that people said was too much deliberation, entrenched thinking, lack of autonomy. And I think all those are kind of reasonable. I think we've all been in the places where it's like, yeah, we have to move quick. We don't have the time to do it. Or no, it's just kind of like how we do things. And the one that really jumped out to me, and it was the largest, or one that explained this for the most, was the lack of data quality. And this one I thought was particularly interesting for this year, because when we think about traditional market research, it's typically has a significant lagging kind of like lead time to it. So if you're contracting with a market agency, well, typically those studies are going to take maybe 6 months to produce, very high cost. And then you're faced with a year like 2020 when there's so much change and so much variation in consumer behavior. Well, the data that we got from 2019 may not really be representative of the market today. And to me, that really comes down into data quality. And so feel like this year there's even greater need to have sources and means to get to actionable and representative data that shows the entire kind of industry. In addition, besides, shifting, it could also be in a location size. So maybe you're operating within a specific group of products and there may be some market research available in some markets, but you're looking to expand into a smaller region or something that you haven't had presence before, but maybe the data doesn't exist in that region. So when we think about it, and for this conversation, we're going to be a little bit more grounded in e-commerce. And so if you think about how consumers are making purchase decisions, there's been several studies on this, and 65% of all e-commerce sessions start with a Google search. Well, wouldn't that be a really good source for decision making then if people essentially are already saying what they're interested in, what they want to buy, and even details around like that purchase? And as SEOs, don't we already have a lot of search data? In addition, doesn't Searchmetrics already have a lot of search data? And these are all excellent points. And this is really where we're getting to how do we surface this and how do we talk about search data in a larger lens of guiding and influencing business decisions. So as SEOs and digital marketers, I think we're all pretty well familiar of some of the basics of what can be surfaced through keyword data. And essentially, you can have the search volume of it. You can know who owns what market share of that, even getting into more tactical sides like CPC, whether using that for campaign management or kind of optimizing your bidding, or even using that as almost a proxy into, as one input into something like a competition for that keyword. But how do we take that and how do we go to influencing things like go-to-market strategy? Or how do we influence things like an advertising strategy? How do we even get out of marketing and influence things like product selection? Maybe this could be in purchasing of how many bikes do we want to purchase for the upcoming year? Or should we buy and double down on skiing or snowboarding? And we can do all this with search data. It's just a matter of how we package and how we aggregate this and how we get this in front of our shared stakeholders. And what we look at in what we need to do is we need to assemble the data. If you just dump and give a thousands and thousands of row CSV or spreadsheet to an executive team of keywords, well, that's not really going to resonate with them. And so we have to learn how to assemble and aggregate this into a more digestible format and also in a more representative format so that the other stakeholders in the organization and the other applications outside of our day-to-day jobs can really take life. So if I think about how do we go about kind of market demand or keyword research data in the past, and I think most of us are familiar with doing manual keyword research. It's something that's been part of SEO from the beginning. And oftentimes people would, turn to tools like AdWords Keyword Planner, or maybe even going into the Searchmetrics suite, looking at keyword discovery. And so for this example, I was like, I want to learn about running shoes and see what that can tell me about the market. So great, I can grab the keyword search volume for running shoes. Awesome. I can actually cluster other similar keywords as well and then look at them based on search volume. So from this, I'm able to capture things like Nike running shoes, Brooks running shoes, Best running shoes, but it's usually all tying back to did it include that same word? And so this is helpful and it brings us beyond just one keyword, but it brings in some inherent kind of biases because it has a human element to it. So I didn't necessarily need to think of Nike, Brooks, or Best, but I did need to think of that seed keyword to start it. So this works as long as you're able to capture all those different synonyms and stuff. But when you're getting to things, and like a more obvious one could be like shoes or sneakers, well, this input here wouldn't capture sneakers, and that one's kind of more obvious. But as you grow and do this in larger scale, this is something that you may have these more inherent biases that could pop up. Another way that we've kind of backed into this and tried to kind of expand the reach from it is also looking at kind of like what's ranking on a domain. So I can input my own domain into our research cloud, and I can see all the ranking keywords that we have in our database on that particular domain. I can do a domain comparison where I'm looking at, let's say, Nike versus Adidas, and I can say, okay, if I'm one of those brands, I can see maybe keywords that the other competitors ranking on that I'm not. But both of these scenarios, you have an inherent bias into the human input that's going into the tool, or you have this bias that's going into like a pre-existing rankings. And so I think both of these can be really useful and powerful, but when we're trying to get at a larger, is this representative of the entire market or the entire category, that's where we begin to kind of get a little more cautious of maybe those limitations of traditional methods. So the key to this, and I think the key element to also elevate search data into the executives and into the other parts of the business, is having a larger data set, having a larger breadth to the number of keywords, how we're aggregating those, and thus making it a more representative sample and increasing our confidence that it's a true representation of what the market demand is. So Searchmetrics, we've been working on other ways to go about this, and we've introduced something that we're calling Searchmetrics Insights. Essentially, this is another way to gather and aggregate keyword data into different taxonomies and structures that then can be representative of those markets. And not to kind of go too into the weeds of that, but essentially what we're doing is we're able to look at a category or a structure and then look at keywords that fall into that category. And then we're not only able to query through our database for the more traditional ways of going about it, like what we saw previously, but we're also then able to dig into, well, what URLs are ranking on those? Looking at the top ranking URLs, we're able to see all the keywords that are ranking on those same URLs that are ranking on that keyword. And then from that, we're able to see how Google is interpreting what else is relevant to that page. And by doing that at scale and querying through the entire database, both from the keyword level and the URL level, is we're able to establish and programmatically grab a larger volume of data. And just to give kind of context to that, if I'm looking at maybe one category within e-commerce and maybe I'm looking at sports and traditional methods, maybe I'd get to 1,000, 5,000, maybe even 10,000 keywords from manual efforts. And this again could be grabbing from Search Console, but again, you have that existing ranking bias. And this method actually will allow us to get to volumes, closer to 500,000 keywords. And by having that larger sample size, we're going to be more representative. And then what we're able to do from that, and this is where it's very similar with traditional keyword research, is we're able to look at all the different attributes and KPIs that go to that. And I think this is a real key of making those connections between business decisions and kind of the larger market, is by having those attributes. So we've clustered these attributes into the groups of demand, growth, competitive, and consumer. And we'll walk through maybe some of the examples or some of the ways that this could be applied outside of more traditional means. So the first one, and kind of our baseline piece that we look at, is demand data. So in this visual here, we are looking at the sporting goods sector, and we wanted to see across 3 different markets, and all markets here is actually the German, the UK, and the US market. And from this, we're able to determine what is the market potential or the search demand of running, soccer, cycling. And from this, it's pretty baseline, but I'm able to say, okay, I can confidently say that running has a stronger global market demand than soccer. I can also go into something more granular, something that kind of jumped out to me is, hey, hiking, climbing, and camping actually has a stronger demand than basketball, which being one of the leading sports in the US, you'd kind of think the other way. But due to the volume and also in outside markets, hey, there I have more of an opportunity there, even though you can see here they're not too far off. So that's kind of your baseline. And this would be looking at the average monthly search volume. So rather than looking at something like a monthly, this would be the aggregate. So I'm thinking in absolute terms. I'm not necessarily thinking on a tactical like marketing campaign activation, but I'm looking at this in terms of overall, where should my focus be? Drilling down a little bit further, we can then go into individual categories within the parent categories. So it's not just sports and then one level down from that. This one, we're actually looking within like the home improvement sector, fireplaces, and then segments within fireplaces. And we're comparing the US to the German market, and we're able to see some pretty big differences between the two. So the total aggregate, if you take population size, is, I mean, Germans from this obviously love their fireplaces, but you can see really well, if I'm operating more in the US market, I'm going to not have as much focus into fireplace ovens, but electrical fireplaces needs to be a larger part of my marketing strategy. And at this point, it's where we actually break out even beyond just like marketing strategy, but then also could be purchasing decisions. If I'm one of the buyers for the fireplace category within a home improvement company, I'm going to purchase and have go more aggressive on the electrical ones. And sure, there could be differences between regions of why this might be. We know, at least here in California, any new buildings due to kind of the wildfires and environmental reasons, you're actually not allowed to have a wood burning fireplace in a new structure in California. So as a result, you have more people turning to electrical, gas, and that becomes more prominent in this market. But if I was a company in EMEA looking into expanding into the US, I may not have that level of detail on it where this will tell me, hey, there's something there, you need to look into it more. Going on from that, and now we're looking kind of at, again, a broader category, but for this, we're able to break down search volume, not just from the aggregate of annual or average monthly, but we're able to break down search volume into individual months, which then we can aggregate into quarters. And then from this, if I'm looking within this home improvement or kind of like household goods category, I'm able to then start making and giving guidance to other teams into when they should be prioritizing. So from this, if I'm thinking for like a campaign activation, I can give guidance of, hey, within the air conditioners Q2, even though maybe temperatures are going to be a little bit higher in Q3, depending on where you live, hey, we really need to activate those campaigns going into Q2 to make sure that we capture that demand across the entire summer months. This could also be used in the form of content production. If I know the peak category or the peak search volume for a quarter for a given category, I can go to the previous category and say that's when I want to be producing my content for it. So in this scenario, at the beginning in January, I would be wanting to actually have my content efforts and my content production moving, so then I can get it live to site, crawled, indexed, ready to go for that peak market demand. Moving on from the demand data is growth data. And this is an area that I think is oftentimes overlooked by a lot of SEOs because we typically default to just what's the immediate. And I think by only looking at the immediate demand, you're losing context into like your industry as a whole. And this is an area that is particularly interesting to myself because oftentimes, like, let's say like you're leading an SEO team and you join a new company. more than likely one of the first questions that you're going to get from the executive team, in what this could be the CMO, the CEO, whatever, is going to be, what's the viable market potential for this category? And so you have to understand what the current is, but then also what's the rate of growth. And this really helps also in putting context into your performance. So if this year I'm operating within the, let's say, fitness category, well, I'm up 20% this year. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. But then I look into the numbers and I see, well, actually, for especially like in the home fitness category, the market has grown a lot more than 20% this year, given to the closure of gyms, et cetera. And so if the actual market growth is 40% or 30%, even though I'm growing at 20%, I'm losing market share to my competitors. This you could reverse the other way around. Say like maybe you're in high-end luxury, which has taken a hit this year, or maybe even travel, and you see, hey, I'm down or I'm flat, I'm 0% growth, but my industry or my category is down 20% this year. I can now go back to leadership and actually have a really positive story and back it by data to show that, hey, yes, we're flat or we're slightly down, but we're still outpacing the market. And in this visual here, what we're looking at is fireplaces again. We can also dive into nuances between industries. And so in the UK and German markets, it's a little more evenly distributed. It follows more of the weather patterns. But then in the US, we see this sharp spike at the same time every year. No surprise, you look where that time lines up, and it's right around Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, it's a time often you're getting together with family after you eat the meal, you're watching football, hanging out by the fireplace. Maybe people are even thinking of Christmas to come. Hey, we need a fireplace, put the stockings on. But it's interesting to see how sharp and how pointed this growth is. And this then can be really valuable information that you pass on to the marketing teams, because it could tell them, hey, for the marketing campaigns for it, we really want to target that peak time to make sure that we're present there. Where in these other markets, I might actually be launching a little bit earlier because it has that more even distribution throughout. Going on again, we can see the difference between subcategories. This is for the German market. This one's a little painful for me personally, seeing how skiing is actually above snowboarding on it. I would disagree as far as which is the better sport, but I can't argue with the numbers. And so if I'm talking to other business managers within the organization, I can say, hey, we need to go more aggressive on skiing, even though it might hurt me a little bit to say that. Moving forward to the competitive side, this I think is an area of us as SEOs are pretty familiar with, but it does again give more line of sight. So if I'm looking at international expansion and I'm in the home improvement category, I can see in the US, this is predominantly owned by two companies or two domains. And so I'm going to be hyper focused on those two because I know that's who's going to be owning that kind of top of page one. And so this is breaking down traffic index. So it would be the estimated traffic based on the search demand of those keywords, position of rankings, SERP features that are present on those queries, and what I can estimate their traffic was during given a period of time. If I'm looking at the UK or German market from this, well, it's a little more even distribution, and I can expect that there's probably going to be highlights or strengths of those brands that I need to dive into a little bit more, which is going to shift how I want to compete with them. Next level to this, competitive data. This one is something that's been emerging over the last couple of years. As Google's understanding intent more, you see more variety in the SERPs. And what we've been doing is we've been classifying keywords into informational, transactional, or navigational intent. And if we look at kind of two big outliers in this group, cable ties has a significant transactional intent where transformers has a larger informational intent. So what that tells me then is if I'm looking to drive revenue within cable ties, I'm going to put a huge focus on product pages, category pages, and I can also expect, even though the average order value might be smaller for that type of category, the conversion rate's going to be a little bit higher. If I switch over and I look at Transformers, well, Transformers has a higher search volume. It's not shown in this visual, but I could go back to previous ones and look at like the search demand of it. But Transformers has a huge informational intent. So now this is a cue to me of, hey, if I want to compete and I want to do well within that category, I should probably also invest in more editorial blog type content that's going to be discussing and educational around Transformers, which will be a higher funnel and then kind of trickle down to my category pages where I'm actually trying to make the transaction. Similar to that is we are scraping these different SERP features that are present on the queries. This you can be using again into the more tactical side of how do you optimize different page templates or categories. The one here, we're looking at business and home security, decor, pool and spa. And from this, I would actually see that, okay, within the business and home security, there's huge presence of videos in the SERPs. So in that area, we might want to invest in more video assets, have YouTube videos, have some integrated onto our pages. But then if I'm kind of shifting over to the decor area, I see that images are much, much higher in the SERPs. So therefore, I'm going to probably put a little bit more time into my image optimization, make sure that we have the proper markup for those pages. And that's going to be more part of my strategy for that category. So from all this, I would say SEO is evolving. It's always evolving. But this year in particular, it's as more companies are being more and more reliant on SEO and digital marketing in general, the opportunity is there for us as SEOs to take this, use our search data, and not only influence how we are marketing and how we're being strategic within our own efforts, but how we're also applying it and getting it to other parts of the organization. So it's up to us to engage with the executives, the strategic marketing groups, portfolio managers, business leaders, and show them the value and the power of search data for their individual domains. Couple plugs here. If you are interested in hearing more on these types of reports or this type of data, you can go to this URL here and have a little information on it. If you'd like to hear a little bit more as far as what's going on in SEO, Kathy Brown, one of our senior SEO managers, myself will be doing a Q3 SEO report next week. So feel free to join that. And I'd say, may the search data guide us. And with that, thank you.
I think, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, but when I say we as digital marketers and SEOs, we're becoming more and more dependent on data. And that kind of sparked to me some talking points I wanted to go over. And one of those is being when you're publishing, or not when you're publishing, but when you're getting ready to plan your content strategy. So let's say we're planning for 2021 now, right? And you had a slide about Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4 data, or you look at the trends with the fireplaces. When would be, in your opinion, the correct time to publish the content about an electrical fireplace? Because I'm guessing if you publish it on Thanksgiving, you've missed the boat, right? So I think for the audience, what would you recommend would be a great strategy to use that data and the trends that you provided?
Excellent. I would, rough rule of thumbs, I usually go for 60 days prior. Depending on kind of like your bandwidth too, like other strategies that I've seen is trying to have like a first published piece of content, maybe even a little bit before, and then having an additional iteration or optimization 6 weeks prior to actual peak time. So the key elements that you want to consider for that is you do want to give enough time for that page to be crawled, indexed. If you do have the bandwidth to do further iterations or optimizations, you'd also want to bake that in as well. But I'd say rule of thumb, usually go for kind of 60 days prior.
Cool. And I guess to me, just to follow up with that, and then I'll let Philip, I know Philip had a couple questions too, but and you pointed to it in one of your last slides there, but I think this data helps with the content strategy, right? With getting everybody in line with the same shit. Like your content team's going to publish something, but your marketing and sales team, you want to make sure they're on the same boat when it comes to promotions and stuff like that. So not to kind of say what you've already said, but I think it's worth pointing out again that this data that you can get from searches really helps get everybody on the same page. So when the sales team is promoting something, the content team has already had that stuff indexed, like you said. So great information.
We've got a question coming in on the chat. Just a reminder, feel free to put any kind of question in that chat. You can ask Tyson anything, and we'll relay your questions. Before we get to the chat, though, Tyson, I had a question. You mentioned sort of showing to how you can see who the heavyweights are in your category, and I guess my question would be kind of what's your advice? Excuse me. What's your advice when you see that? Do you attack them where they're strong? So focus on kind of the topics and keywords where they're really strong, and you try to beat them out if they're the heavyweights, or is it better to kind of try to find the long tail keywords where they're weak or something else?
I think that's a great question, and I'd qualify a little bit by being honest with your own domain's power and authority, so to speak. So if, let's say, you're a large domain that's been weaker in a specific category, and then you're looking at, okay, I need to now compete with Home Depot, and let's say, for argument's sake, you're Amazon. Okay, well, I can be a bit more aggressive of going to head with those key areas. To your question too, though, and I think more common is you're entering in and you may be a smaller player and you're looking at this daunting Home Depot, Lowe's, how am I going to compete with them? And I think, and you kind of alluded to this, is going after those niche areas that you can offer additional value, and also they may not be paying as much attention to it. So if I'm a smaller player and I'm looking that, I'll look for gaps of where they are weak. And it's, oftentimes you can find those more long tail kind of specific categories. And then I'll look to build upon those to work my way up to those larger categories. So I think for smaller companies, look for the gaps, for the weaknesses. Maybe it's subcategories, or maybe it's even, further levels down. But I think that's typically a good strategy, especially if you're, the smaller company trying to compete with the heavyweights.
Got it. But just as table stakes, do you need something on your site about kind of the big keyword, the keyword that has the volume, knowing you're probably not going to topple the heavyweights, right? And then you kind of go niche? Or are you saying you should, I'm not sure if this is a great example, but let's say it's washer dryers. That's a huge keyword, whereas, I don't know, stackable washer dryer, maybe not so much. Do you need to have some kind of just general content about the big category and then you go into the detail on the stackable dryer? Or you're saying start with stackable dryer because that's a niche and that's where you can kind of make some headway, and then you'll build yourself up?
I would say, make sure first and foremost that the user experience, when if they're just coming through your site, so it's I'd want to have the basics for the washer and dryer, but then if I'm where am I doubling down and really making my effort, that's where maybe stackable. So I'd say it's not to say, hey, you can completely ignore that, because you want to show that you're relevant to that larger kind of category. But as far as where do I think I can achieve higher rankings and then build upon that success, that's where I think the more niche is the way to go.
Got it.
Cool. So like Philip said, we do have a question coming in. Before I get to that question, I am going to share a handout that Tyson sent over. It's just a PDF about Searchmetrics and their insights that they can offer to you. I don't know, Tyson, if you want to give a little bit more background on that PDF that I just shared, but that is out there for people to click on.
Yeah, it's pretty similar information that what we talked about. I mean, I think the big takeaway for this that I'd have is, regardless if you're using our insights reports or you are doing this in more traditional, I think you can apply the same takeaways, and the value of search data is there. And so the biggest, I guess, recommendation, or kind of me being on the soapbox, is to leverage search data beyond just the tactical sense. And so, yeah, like this link or this PDF will give just a little more information of that product to it. But I would say, regardless of what you're already operating with, think of search data in how it can influence other parts of the business, which I think, again, is a way for us as SEOs to, get out of the corner a little bit of the organization and be more of kind of like a driving force versus a responsive, hey, we already launched this, can you optimize these pages?
Got it. That makes sense. All right. So the first question is from Jim, and it's a question that I've had looking at content and content strategy before. And he said, is it worth it to target featured snippets now that you lose the organic spot?
Great question. This is, I've been in several debates around this topic, actually, with other SEOs, and you'll get a variety of different answers. So I'm just going to give my personal side of it. So one, I've heard the argument, hey, I'd rather actually get the clicks on it than them just getting the information on the query. So the first thing that I would say to that is, I get the point, but then you're also giving that presence then to someone else. And if you're thinking of, well, if the user's getting the information from the featured snippet already, wouldn't that have an indirect impact on your click-through rate of being in the actual number one organic place? So I typically would default to wanting still to have that presence, even if I lose out on it. But I think where it gets a little more interesting is, one, to think about the information that you're trying to get there. Oftentimes, and it will vary depending on keywords, oftentimes you can still get higher clicks by having that position than maybe the number one organic spot. The other piece that I think is oftentimes overlooked is you have to look at the URL's keyword portfolio as a whole. And one keyword is not necessarily going to drive the entire performance of that URL. And when we're looking at the featured snippets, we're looking at one keyword. So if my website is getting picked up for the featured snippet in one keyword, I probably have a relatively strong URL, and I'm going to actually anticipate that actually my overall rankings on that portfolio of keywords is probably going to be a little bit stronger. So I wouldn't be as worried about that one keyword, but more on like the overall performance of the URL. And then again, just personally speaking, I probably would still take the the featured snippet, because I think a lot of times you can get a pretty good click-through rate from the link there, even if it means that your standard organic listing is not present.
Kind of one thing, going back to your presentation, I thought it was really interesting where you could look at a category and show how often, video shows up in the search results, or, images, those kind of things. And you compared, decor versus other things. So going to the video thing, are you guys able to sort of tell why a video is ranking? Is there any correlation between kind of number of views? If there's one video that's, got 1 million views and another video that has 1,000 views, is Google going to use that in terms of, how do they decide which video, should a video go in the search results, and then which video should go in there?
Yeah, and to be honest, I haven't done as much in the video optimization kind of place. So it's more of a strategy of like, hey, and I've had conversations with, e-commerce clients where they typically would have like a one size fits all to category pages or product pages. And so how I've used this in the past has been more on influencing the type of content. And so content, as you know, can come in a bunch of different mediums, whether it's traditional written copy, whether it's variations of written copy, video, images, etc. And so I think for me, how I like to use it is more of like, hey, within this category, video's a stronger presence. So therefore, let's integrate that into the copy and the content on the page. And then others, hey, video's not really showing up much. It's a very quick transactional term. People aren't spending as much time on those pages. Let's shift the focus more into maybe it's bulleted lists, maybe it's, image optimization, etc. So I'd say from my perspective, it's more into the types and how you're kind of optimizing the page. The less experience more on the actual optimization of the video asset in relation to rankings.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I think a lot of times as SEOs, we're trying to figure out that there's some secret or something, but often it's just looking at what are the people who rank well doing, right? So I don't know if the keyword is boomerang and you find that everybody on the first page of Google somewhere in their content has the word Australia. Well, you probably want to put the word Australia in there because Google is somehow kind of mapping those two. So you're saying if you're seeing that video is what videos are getting in there, and that's what ranks well for that keyword, that category, then that's a sense, again, going back to table stakes, that's kind of what you need to do if you're going to have a shot.
Yeah, and I would also advocate on this it should be something not like a look at it once and forget it and move on, because as we know, Google's continuously evolving how and what they're showing, and that's going to change as time goes on. And so I think that's something that I would highly recommend people coming back to and revisiting over and over and over, and viewing it as like a continuous process versus a one-time, cool, that category is done, I can move on, and I don't have to look back at it until next year when it peaks again.
Got it.
Tyson, I have one more question, kind of around keyword research, and where you're seeing the trends and stuff like that year over year. I guess in a general, I'm trying to make it as general as possible, but if you could give our viewers kind of one insight or one tip in regards to keyword research, and like what data to use. Obviously, there's so many tools out there. Some are free, some are paid. They can help you find relative keywords, but from being in the industry and from working at Searchmetrics and having access to all this data, I guess, what is a tip from you or a trick from you when it comes to just getting started with keyword research and using that to make your marketing decisions?
Yeah, I think a couple recommendations here is oftentimes with a lot of the tools, you'll have access to a lot of the attributes, but I see too often people will just focus on the average monthly search demand. And so I think one, making sure you're gathering in all the attributes from the beginning, because then you can dissect and kind of, pivot accordingly. And so it's like, I'd say step one, when you are at that first step, gather as many attributes on the keyword level as you can, because you then can always aggregate those up and have summaries on your category levels. The other piece that I would say, and a little bit in that same line of thought, is to be drilling into the monthly amount. And then if you can, the historical, I think, and that's like one of my areas that I really like looking at is the historical, because to me, it frames up the context of the category, or if you're looking at just one point, you lose that. And so I would say if you can, always get your monthly, and then that way you can put that into quarterly representations. You can leave it as a monthly calendar. You have the flexibility to pivot in those different directions. And then I'd say the final aspect too on looking at it is also, getting to the larger volume, and don't consider one keyword being representative of an entire category. And it's the same notion or thought process in the feature snippet question. That's one keyword on maybe the hundreds on that URL. So you want to kind of also take a broad stroke in the beginning to have that kind of full perspective of the category. And it's always easier to hide or remove or pull out certain things. But if when you're gathering, if you only gather that demand, well, then that's the only possibility you have for it. So I think that's just the fundamental piece, is when you are going through the process, grab as much as you can from the beginning. And then even if maybe some pieces you don't use, at least you have them, versus getting through the process and then going backwards is way more work. And you're going to have to basically redo the same steps and process just to expand on what you're offering.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's great information. And this is perhaps a discussion for another day, but I would love to see the data that Textbroker has, right, from all the different content links and the content topics and the trends, and see how long it takes. Like when we see something trending here at Textbroker, how long it takes you to see it in the search results, right? I think that would be something really interesting to dive into.
Yeah, we should pair up on a study there.
Hey, Tyson, we're getting close on time here. You had mentioned at the end of your presentation that you're going to be talking about kind of Q3 trends in the next week. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask if you could give us any kind of hints or anything you're seeing now in terms of search trends. I don't want to steal your thunder from next week, but what should our audience be thinking about? Anything that's kind of the latest and greatest that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think Q3 brought obviously it's 2020, so it wouldn't be a normal quarter in 2020 without hiccups and stuff. So we do touch on some of the pieces around some of the indexing bugs that Google ran into. One, I think their communication around it has been a lot better, so that's been appreciated. But it also a little bit of a reminder too of things like how caffeine impacts and like the indexation process. Other kind of minor, I guess you could, depending on who you're talking to, minor, but some advancements in like different types of structured data, how Google's really doubling down on e-commerce. And I think we've seen that throughout this pandemic, where they announced the free Google listings, which started in the US. Now it's been rolled out globally. To me, this is an area that they recognize that the competition between Amazon and Google has been heating up. And, I think if you talk to a lot of people, Amazon has a leg up in a lot of regards. And so by the free listings, to me, that's also a way of them building out their inventory more, that then allows them to apply it. And then you layer in other pieces like structured data on shipping details that I would anticipate is going to show up in the SERPs as well. So I think there's several pieces that have kind of showed Google's hand a little bit on how they're going to be ratcheting up on the e-commerce focus. And then also we touch a little bit on kind of what's coming up with Google. So we touch on some of the elements that were announced on Google's On Search 2020. So we'll get into the BERT topic, things like indexing passages, subtopics within a top of funnel parent term, and more of kind of some things that you can expect to see, I think, going into 2021. And then one other minor piece, which may not get into as much detail during the webinar, but I think it ties into the, commerce and things like that. One of the announcements too that they made is if you're using Chrome or the Google app, you can click on any picture and then it will actually use Google Lens to then bring up all the different websites that may sell that product. And so I think that is something that I anticipate to see further and further expanded upon. They've launched Google Lens way back, where you could take a picture of a product, maybe you're shopping or a friend's wearing something you like, take a picture, it'll show you retailers that sell it. Now bringing that into the general browsing experience, I think will be an interesting kind of piece to throw into the whole competition between Google and Amazon going into end of this year and beginning of next year.
Earlier today we were talking to Barry Schwartz and we spent a little bit of time about passage indexing. And I know it hasn't even rolled out yet, so there is no data that you can kind of look at to see what the impact is. But Google has told us that they think it'll impact about 7% of queries. Mm-hmm. Do you have any kind of initial thoughts on that? Anything that our audience should be thinking about or doing in advance of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Barry's a great source for that, and I certainly went through all of his publications that he had out. So I don't know if I would have too much of this time to probably add on top of what he's already mentioned from it. For me personally, though, I think it's really interesting how a lot of these pieces are in the same vein where, it's not technically related, but you have kind of the announcement of, hey, BERT went from 10% when it initially launched to now on virtually every single English query. Now you're getting things like passages. You're also getting to things like the subtopics within the topic. And I would expect to see a little more variation on those like head terms from it. But from my perspective, a lot of these all fall in the similar vein of Google's understanding of intent. And certainly they've used BERT for it. And I think those advances are allowing them to open up things like passage indexing. And I think in nature of it, because, as they describe, is looking for the needle in the haystack of the specific term. And I think in the search on, the example they said was something along the lines of, how do I determine if my windows are UV glass? And well, the answer may not be an entire article, but it could be just a little snippet in a message board that's, well, hold a match up to it and you can see how it reflects. So I think that's something that I wouldn't necessarily expect to be like, great, next year it's going to be on 50% of queries. Like, I think it'll be more niche in nature based on like how it's being used. But I do see it as something that's really interesting because it shows a little bit the direction and how we can anticipate search evolving in the upcoming years.
Yeah, no, we typically see clients, they'll order content and really try to have that content focused on one main keyword. And I guess we just wonder with passage indexing, are you better off now with a really long piece of content on a page, knowing that you don't need to necessarily have a totally separate page just focused on that keyword, because Google's getting better and better, and they'll pick it up even if it's kind of the 15th paragraph on a very long page.
And I think that is a fair assumption. I think it's also, in my perspective, pretty much in line with a lot of the things that we've seen Google evolving of. So it's like, if you went, and I know you've been in SEO long enough to see this, it's like way back, it was like one keyword, one landing page kind of type approach. And we've already shifted to this like, hey, you can have one page rank for hundreds or thousands of keywords already. And to your point, I think that this is something that would actually probably just increase that a little bit further with 7%. Okay, it's not going to be like huge 9-day difference, but I think it's just further evidence and further support of this more longer form holistic content, which, we've seen over the years that Google has been rewarding.
Got it.
Awesome. Well, again, Tyson, we definitely appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, show us some of the data that you guys have at Searchmetrics. Again, we hope to hear more from you. I'm excited for this Q3 webinar that you guys are putting on next week. Just from the teaser, it sounds like a lot of great info there. We are going to kind of hurry and go through the polling process. We do have Jim Boykin coming up just about 3 minutes. So if you guys want to click on the Take the Poll Now link, it'll take you to, so you can rate Tyson, as he is one of our competitors in the Digital Marketing League. So go ahead and take the poll, rate how you thought his presentation was. We will leave that open for just a little while so you guys have a chance to take that poll. Looks like some people are still trickling in. Got to make sure it's live. Yep, there we go. So we will leave that open for probably just about 10 more seconds. And as a reminder, by participating in this poll, you are entering for a chance to win a $100 voucher at textbroker.com that you can use for your upcoming content projects. And in the chat, Tuana says, this is going to be hard. Everyone has brought their A game. I would agree. a lot from first thing in the morning with Barry, and then Luis, and now Tyson. A lot of great information that not only the marketing team, but I think Phil can speak from an executive level, a lot of good information being brought, especially during the start of Q4 and planning into Q1 of 2021. So we are happy you guys are getting information out of this. We will go ahead, Cassandra. Let's move on to the next question, which is just what was your main takeaway from this presentation? Reminder, it is an open-ended poll, so you can type in whatever you want. If you just want it to be a sentence or two, that is great. If you just want it to be one word, which is data, that is fine as well. I think that would fit. So we'll leave that open for just a little while. Let's see, it looks like we're still getting some answers, so we'll leave that open. Let's leave that up for maybe about 10 more seconds, Cassandra, and then we'll go to the last one, which again is if you're in it for the raffle, is probably the most critical question because we need your email address so we can pick the winner. So we can send you your voucher for $100 worth of content. You can use it on Textbroker. And maybe if you want to use it towards a long form piece of content with multiple different topics, that would be a good idea. So let's go ahead and close. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to throw in a random kind of piece, just anyone in e-commerce that's on the webinar. Little recommendation, I would anticipate and say be prepared for potentially campaigns to roll out earlier this year without as much of like an in-store Black Friday. Personally, I anticipate it's going to be a little less pointed on individual dates. So my recommendation, what I've heard from their e-commerce companies is the anticipation is sales and things will probably release earlier. So I'd just say make sure that you guys are ready and you have all your collateral ready to potentially roll out earlier if it comes down from the powers that be.
That is great to know. And then I believe the last question I think is back up. Some people didn't get to enter their email address in there, so go ahead and do that now while it's open. And while you guys are doing that, just one more virtual round of applause for Tyson and the team at Searchmetrics for providing us with that great information. And yeah, I think we definitely appreciate you having you on, and we'll let you go.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me, guys.